debt, corruption, runaway inflation, and a weakening currency. Has that in itself disenfranchised the electorate the most?
Yeah, so what has happened during the reign of the PF, and especially during President Lungu's reign, is the inflation and ballooning of the debt, which was a couple of billions in 2016, but now it's over 12 billion. And this has eroded incomes and earnings of the ordinary people. And there's been rising mass unemployment. Now, what we had during the run-up to the election was a feeling of disenchantment and lack of confidence in any of the candidates, the key contenders, President Lungu and his arch-rival, the billionaire Hichilema. But what we've observed in the few days is a lesson for analysts to say there is always more to context than what you see and you observe. Zambians have really come out in their numbers than what was predicted, even in the previous surveys. And it is in this show of protest, from an analytical perspective, where they are protesting against the system, and they've come out in their numbers, so that even the rigging processes has failed. The intimidation tactics that were deployed by President Lungu 2 weeks ago, when he deployed the military in the cities and in the streets as a preemptive measure, have failed to work. It's important to recognize that it's not over until the last ballot is counted. And as it stands now, we do not know what has been the actual voter turnout. But what we have is 20% of the votes of the constituencies are in, is a good 76% of voter turnout, which is impressive. And this was last seen, I think, 1991 when on the country's first multi-party elections.
Mm. And I want to talk about that voter turnout and what it says about how people view government spending and what you put as a tight squeeze on social development budget.
So what we have is we need to understand the characteristics of Zambians in terms of how they are politically active and how over the years they've come to realize the power that the voters hold. And I think this is the impetus behind the move and the higher voter turnout, a realization. And Zambia is the only country in Southern Africa, in Malawi, that has changed ruling parties 3 times. And they've grown in their confidence and the realization that the decisions that they make on election day will affect them in 5 years. And this is a protest against the mismanagement of the economy, high unemployment, the corruption that has been very rampant during President Lungu's reign. And if the youth vote going up exponentially, showing the dissatisfaction with the status quo from the young people.
Mm-hmm. And I find this interesting as you looking back at the record of the incumbent and his party. He was a reluctant president who didn't even want to consider a second term, as you say, but now there seems to be a clamping down of civil and political liberties. Just talk to us about the temptation of absolute power in incumbency, and is it possibly why we're seeing Hichilema gain a lead even in what were perceived to be Lungu constituencies?
So there's been a lot that has been said in trying to understand the character of President Lungu. We should not forget that every politician is in the business of seeking higher office. So in spite of what political posturing they make, higher office is the ultimate goal of a politician. And having been in power, African politicians especially, but we have seen this recently even in America, politicians are now reluctant to leave office. And for Africans, it's that there are no clear incentive of what becomes of a former president. Right? And this is really the space whereas in other countries they take up new public spaces, they become influencers, they take up new roles for themselves. Many African presidents just disappear into oblivion. And for President Lungu, who is not even the average age of an African president, he is looking at himself as having 20, 30 years of oblivion. And that is a difficult concept for many politicians who have been used to the trappings of power. And as the old saying goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What we have seen in the last 5 years is President Lungu really consolidating his power, clamping down on civic space, trying to use money, and this is where the borrowing has come in, trying to use money, the borrowing from poorly structured loans from the Chinese especially, but for all across the international financial markets, that have really put the heavy burden on Zambians at the $19 billion debt hanging over their heads. But he has used this for some vanity projects. Now, this is a difficult concept to understand given that Africa really needs infrastructure development. But when infrastructure development is not in tandem with other priorities such as social development, public health, education, you then have to understand why we are moving towards more visible projects other than the intangibles. And the tangible or visible projects are good political mileage. And that is why President Lungu continued on a borrowing spree to try and spruce up his image with public projects and infrastructure development, which at the moment was not really the high priority given the pandemic that has really affected Zambia as it has across the region.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing those insights. Ringisai Chikohomero, a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies.